Thank you, John, for the very kind introduction. Always an embarrassing moment for me. But most of all, thank you for coming here in this rather cold night. You know, I come from California. We were in our 70s, and all of a sudden. But I lived here for 9 years, so I'm used to this, and it's always a pleasure to be back and to be back in this place and see so many friends, old and new. So as John was saying, what we are going to explore today is a kind of introduction to this weekend program that we are going to have. This weekend program will be hybrid, meaning that will be in person and also online, in which we are going to explore the Theosophical Society, what's the work that we are doing, what's the work that needs to be done in the future, taking into account the state of our world and our society. I'm always very excited about the work that we are doing. I really believe in this. I think, as we are going to see, I think the society has had a huge impact in our culture, and more is to come. But all this happens very slowly. However, I think the work of this organization and also all earnest spiritual traditions is what keeps me optimistic. In spite of all the difficulties and troubles that we are very well aware, I am optimistic about the world, about humanity, about the process of growth. And all of this is because of organizations like this. Not only the worldview that allows us to understand the world in a different way, but also because of the work that is being done. So since this talk is about the influence that the society has had in our culture, in the world, let us start recapping what was going on when the society was founded in 1875, toward the end of the 19th century. So there were several cultural shifts and transformations that were taking place. There was a growing economic inequality, which we are again experiencing. And this was because, especially in the Western world, meaning Europe and the US and perhaps Australia, for example, at the time there was a very rapid industrial growth. And people were working, they had work, but we could already see the gap in the distribution of wealth. And that was producing unrest among people, right? There was, along with that, an educational reform, mainly because governments wanted the workers to be educated so that they could do their works better. So the education became more systematized. There were efforts to bring education into more and more people. And also this education took on a secular bent. Secular is like the opposite to religious or spiritual. A secular view is one that dismisses anything that is not connected to just social and political and scientific matters. This was fueled by a revolution also in science, when Darwin, in the second half of the 19th century, proposes the theory of evolution. This was a great shock for the religious worldview of the time. Again, in the West, I'm examining the influence on the Western world mostly, although I'm going to talk about also on the East. So at the time, most people thought that God had created animals and people just like that. There was no evolution. And when Darwin proposes this was a shock, as I said. most people, educated people, embraced immediately that scientific view. And therefore, most of those people who were educated were rapidly becoming agnostics, meaning that they didn't have any religious belief, and also materialist. This was even the case in Annie Besant, who would eventually join the Theosophical Society and become the second international president of the Theosophical Society. But for a while, she was an atheist, and she thought that the answer to all human problems was in science and in politics and in social action. And she was a national hero in England. This was a few years before the founding of the Theosophical Society, working for the human rights, basically. But eventually she felt that something more was needed to help humanity, that she was addressing only the external manifestations and not the root causes of inequalities and all of this. But in any case, at this time, most of the educated people were rapidly departing from religion, and then also because of the growth of technology, life began to be more pleasant. You know, in the, let's say, Middle Ages, life was hard for most people, except for the elites. But for most people, life was hard, physically hard. There was very little comfort. And along with that, people had the religious view was that you couldn't really be happy in physical life while you are alive, you know, with a body, that true happiness was only possible in heaven. And that kept people going because that's what they thought. Okay, this is just a prelude for heaven, and it's hard because it's meant to be hard. Now, as science begins to develop, the technology begins to develop more and more comfort, then people began to take the idea of pleasure as an essential right in their lives and demand pleasure. And there was gradually a bent toward a kind of hedonism. You know, hedonism means the hedonists were a group of Greek philosophers who basically were saying pleasure is happiness, and the purpose of life is to be happy, to have pleasure. Of course, they had a more sophisticated view, because then when they defined pleasure, they would say, sure, there is physical pleasure, but the emotional pleasure is higher, the intellectual pleasure is higher, you know. But in any case, the idea of we live only one life, the people were, as I said, dropping the spiritual ideals, and we are here to feel happy, to feel pleasure. So there was this growing focus on that approach, which ends up in the consumerism that we have today. It all started around the time that the Theosophical Society was founded. So that's more or less the situation. And then in 1875, the Theosophical Society is founded. Now, as we are going to explore during the weekend more in detail, I'll just mention that the organization was not just motivated by a bunch of people that came and say, let's do this, let us get together and pursue this line of work, but it was inspired by some, let's call them yogis, that one of the founders, Madame Blavatsky, had found during her travels, and they were apparently aware of what was going on in the world, and they wanted to do something to help the world. So they asked Blavatsky if she would be willing to do something like what became the Theosophical Society. And we actually have a letter from one of these, what today we could call, they had a high level of enlightenment, let's say. I don't like to put labels and all that, but they were very wise people. And we have one letter from one of these individuals who was like the leader of this community of enlightened beings, who made what I call an occult diagnosis of the world, occult in the sense of hidden, taking into account the hidden aspect of the world. And he wrote that the intellectual portions of mankind, and of course this was written, in the 1880s, so you will see all gender language and things like that that were the norm at the time. So the intellectual portions of mankind, and by that he meant what we call today the elites or the leaders of humanity, seem to be fast dividing into two classes. So he said, the one class, which he was referring to the religious leaders, who are moving towards the deliberate surrender of their intellect. I'm going to stop almost at every phrase because this has a profound meaning. So they were observing that religion in the West was becoming more and more fundamentalist and more superstitious. Superstition means, a superstition is something that you embrace as a truth without seeing the reasons why this could be a truth, right? For example, you may believe in something that is true, but if you don't know, if it doesn't make sense to you and you embrace it, that is what normally is called a superstition. So for example, if I tell you, yes, I can sit and can levitate, well, that goes against what you normally understand how the world functions. And if you just embrace that, that is a superstition. Now, if you say, okay, explain how that can be possible. And then you are explaining, well, there are other forces in the cosmos and this and that. And then somebody gives you a logical explanation. Then you can embrace it. You don't yet know if it is true or not. But you are not violating your reason, and you say, okay, there is an explanation that makes sense. Maybe you have to investigate that to determine whether it is true or not, but it is something that you can make sense of. So superstition, even if it is a truth, what superstition does is that it's basically the foundation for what we call fake news. When you start consuming information and embracing points of view that you don't see how they make sense, then your mind or intellect, as the teacher says here, becomes unable to discern truth from false. So the Theosophical Society from the beginning was very much against any form of superstition. And that's why in the Theosophical literature, you have very detailed accounts of how things work. Talk about karma. You can talk about karma in a general sense, but the Theosophical tradition explains very specifically how karma works, what unites one cause to the effect, how is that produced in your current circumstances, how that connects to the karma that other people are producing. So that when you hold a view, you hold a rational view, a view that you are not making violence on your understanding. So this teacher that in the Theosophical literature is called by the Sanskrit words Mahachohan, like great teacher. The Mahachohan here is saying there is one class in humanity, the religious leaders, that are moving towards the deliberate surrender of their intellect, its imprisonment in the narrow grooves of bigotry and superstition. So let's stop there. So they were seeing this tendency toward fundamentalism. And then what comes later is part of what I was explaining, a process which cannot fail to lead to the utter deformation of the intellectual principle. The idea is that when you persist in blind faith, when what you believe is constantly violating your sense of what is reasonable, you lose the ability to distinguish what is true and what is not. So this was what was happening to this part of the leaders of humanity, the religious leaders. And then the other, he says, that would be the materialistic leaders, unrestrainedly indulging its animal propensities. The word animal was used at the time as biological or instinctive. You know, for example, Mesmer would talk about animal magnetism. He meant a magnetism that doesn't come from magnets, that comes from organisms. So what today we would call biomagnetism, he called animal magnetism. So this is similar to that. The materialistic people were more and more indulging in all the lowest biological aspects. And by lowest, I mean from a spiritual point of view. There is nothing wrong with pleasure, but when you live for pleasure, then your consciousness begins to, again, to degenerate in a sense into what we see today. In many people, especially in those people with power or with fame, or what do we see in people who have everything that they want to have? They normally tend to use all those resources into just personal pleasure, selfish pleasure, and things like that. So they were seeing this, indulging in its animal propensities with the deliberate intention of submitting. And the last part is more part of the Theosophical teachings. We won't go too much into this. But submitting to millenniums of degradation after physical dissolution. That has to do with what happens after we die. Basically, in the life after death, we continue nurturing the tendencies that we created in our daily life. And after death, you have the possibility of either generate great growth for yourself or great degradation for yourself. And that's what he's talking about here. So they were seeing a world that was fast dividing into these two camps. The materialistic people were only what is, pleasure and selfishness and materialism and consumerism was the only thing that mattered. And the religious people that were becoming more and more fundamentalist, less and less rational, and this was the clash that was coming, that they were seeing coming. So then this was happening first at the level of the leaders, the people who the majority of humanity follow. So those intellectual classes reacting upon the ignorant masses, which they attract, and which look up to them as noble and fit examples to follow, degrade and morally ruin those they ought to protect and guide. Between degrading superstition and still more degrading brutal materialism, the white dove of truth has hardly room where to rest her weary and welcome foot. It's time that Theosophy should enter the arena. So the idea was to propose a third option, to propose a rational spirituality and also a spiritual science. As we are going to see, the Theosophical Society was the first organization to begin to work in the field of science and spirituality. Now, when this is what these Blavatsky's teachers, who would become Blavatsky's teachers, were seen in the world. And this was because humanity was entering a difficult cycle. Blavatsky wrote about this. She said, "We are in the very midst of the Egyptian darkness of Kali Yuga, the Black Age." Kali Yuga is a Hindu concept. We are, according to Hindu chronology, also to Egyptian chronology, in the Black Age, in the materialistic age, and all of this. And Blavatsky says, the first 5,000 years of which its dreary first cycle is preparing to close on the world between 1897 and 98. So this Kali Yuga is very long, 432,000 years. And within the Kali Yuga, there are minor cycles. And the first cycle of 5,000 years was closing around that age, she said. So she said, what her teachers were saying is that if we cannot launch a different alternative for those people who are not going to fall in either category or have the seeds not to fall in either category, materialism or fundamentalism, if we cannot launch something before that, then the opportunity will be lost to do that. And humanity will divide, more sharply into these two extremes. We see the polarization. I mean, they were seeing the polarization that was coming. The polarization is part of the cycle of Kali Yuga, so that's part of why they wanted to do something like the Theosophical Society. Now, to show you that, because I'm making all these claims that they knew what was coming, etc., but to show you an instance of something that may justify what I'm saying is the following thing that Blavatsky wrote. She, in an article in 1888, she predicted the rise of Hitler and the Second War. And you will see, she was talking about Europe, what Europe was doing, and she wrote, and she was saying, the actions of the European countries are leading to this. The article was called, suggestively enough, Karmic Visions. So this may have seen something that she saw. So she writes, what is thy future kingdom now? A legion of war puppets as units, a great wild beast in their collectivity. A beast that, like the sea yonder, slumbers gloomily now. So she says, you are creating a beast that right now is slumbering, but to fall with the more fury on the first enemy that is indicated to it. So basically, from the theosophical point of view, wars are the result not just of geopolitical and religious problems, but the violence that we all human beings indulge in our daily life in big or small measure. All this is energy that begins to accumulate on the inner planes, let's say on the astral plane. This energy has its own tendency in the theosophical view. Everything is alive. So energies have their own intelligence. The energies try to reproduce themselves. So when, as humanity, we indulge in selfishness, in aggression, in separation, and all of this, we start generating this monster, this potential for violence that at some point channels itself either through some external conflict, sometimes through natural disasters, earthquakes, or things like that. So this is what she's saying there. You are generating this beast that right now is latent there, but that it will wake up and attack. And who is this beast going to attack? She says, the first enemy that is indicated to it. And then she says, indicated by whom? And then she says, probably this is what she was seeing, it is as though a heartless, proud fiend, assuming sudden authority, incarnate ambition and power, had clutched with iron hand the minds of a whole country. So somebody suddenly comes to power and it's like it dominates a whole country, the minds of a whole country. By what wicked enchantment has he brought the people back to those primeval days of their nation when their Germanic ancestors, the yellow-haired Suavi and the treacherous Franks, these are Germanic tribes in the past. So she, with talking about these tribes, she's pointing out in what country this was going to happen. When they roamed about in their warlike spirit, thirsting to kill, to decimate and subject each other. By what infernal powers has this been accomplished? And she continues, Yet the transformation has been produced as it is as undeniable as the fact that alone the fiend rejoices and boasts of the transformation effected. The whole world is hushed in breathless expectation. Not a wife or mother, but is haunted in her dreams by the black and ominous storm cloud that overhangs the whole of Europe. The cloud is approaching. It comes nearer and nearer. Oh, woe and horror. I foresee once more for earth the suffering I have already witnessed. I read the fatal destiny upon the brow of the flower of Europe's youth. So you see, when Blavatsky and her teachers decided to make this experiment, because they said the Theosophical Society was an experiment, they were taking into account all of this. They knew what was coming. It was karmic. According to the Theosophical view, we generate causes, and those causes we have to reap, and in reaping those causes, we learn and grow. Unfortunately, out of the suffering, we grow, because see that after the two wars, Europe needed such a horror to say, okay, let us stop, let us come together. How do we ensure that this doesn't happen any longer? And then all the European Union and all of this is a result of this experience. If you read the history of Europe, it's a history of wars. There was always one country in a war with another. And then this horror was necessary for humanity to say, okay, maybe we should stop doing this. So that's why even the difficulties that we go through right now, they have an educational intention, let's say. Now, if we are smart, we don't need to suffer so much before we realize we need to go in a different direction. If we don't, if we continue to choose our greed and our selfishness and all that, then we will keep going further and further into the difficulties until we are forced to rethink what we are doing as humanity. But although these things are karmic, help is always available. And the movement that was started with the Theosophical Society was part of that help that they wanted to give humanity in this difficult cycle. So basically the response behind the veil, because this is how I call it, this is part of these enlightened beings that were aware of what was going on, and what they proposed was the formation of the Theosophical Society. Although this was part of a broader movement, in one of the letters from one of Blavatsky's teachers, they engaged in correspondence with some early members of the Theosophical Society, and he says, there is more of this movement that you have yet had an inkling of, and the work of the TS is linked in with similar work that is secretly going on in all parts of the world. Even in the TS, there is a division managed by a Greek brother about which not a person in the society has suspicion, excepting the old woman, that's how Blavatsky called herself, and Olcott. Anyway, Olcott was the president of the Theosophical Society. Blavatsky and Olcott were the two main founders. So they say that they were trying to stimulate humanity's spirituality in several fields. We don't know what they were referring to, but for example, at the time, exactly this time, in the 1880s, in Tibet, there are four main schools of Tibetan Buddhism, plus the Bons that were the natives there. And in many parts of their history, they were if not wars, they were fighting each other. There was no cooperation between them. And at this time, because they have very different views, even though they are all Tibetan Buddhist schools, they have differences. And at this point, a movement within Tibetan Buddhism arose by some monks that they are the same that the Theosophical Society was doing in the world. They started to promote a more comparative approach to their different points of view, a less dogmatic approach, a cooperation. And what we see today, that the different schools cooperate with each other, that started at the time that the Theosophical Society was being founded. So perhaps that was part of the work that the master is referring here. In the TS, many times these Blavatsky's teachers, they are called masters of wisdom. So that's why I was referring to them like that. But all of this was, as I said, an experiment, and this is a question of stimulating aspects of humanity, but you cannot try to force anything to humanity or violate the free will. So neither Blavatsky nor the Mahatmas knew if this was going to work. It depended on us, if we were receptive to it. So for example, Blavatsky says, unless we succeed in placing the TS before this date, she's referring to the 1897-98, that was when the cycle was about to close. Unless we succeed in placing the TS before this date on the safe side of the spiritual current, it will be swept away irretrievably into the deep cold failure, and the cold waves of oblivion will close over its doomed head. Thus will have ingloriously perished the only association whose aims, rules, and original purposes answer in every particular and detailed, if they are strictly carried out, to the innermost fundamental thought of every great adept reformer, the beautiful dream of a universal brotherhood of men. Again, don't pay attention to the gender language. The first object of the Theosophical Society is to form a universal nucleus of a universal brotherhood of men without distinction of race, sex, caste, and color. So they were always thinking of both, but man was used to define male and female at the time, right? But anyway, I bring this quote because Blavatsky says it's possible that humanity will reject this attempt, and that's it, and the TS will fail and disappear. But when she says it's the only movement that is working explicitly for this, for universal brotherhood, it's because at the time this was true. There were many brotherhoods. Like Christians, they were all brothers, or brothers and sisters, siblings, whatever we want to say. But you were brothers with those who belong to your same religion. Like Jesus said, even the thieves are brotherly with each other and they cooperate. But what's the purpose in a brotherhood that is separative, that is, I'm connected only with these people, and therefore we are against those others. So part of what the masters and Blavatsky made emphasis is the idea of creating a universal brotherhood, where people from different religions could come and cooperate, even if they were doing different things, come and cooperate together. So that's what we are going to see next. So let us break up the talk in two, so that it's not so long for you to be in a passive mood. So is there any question or comment about this so far? This is the introduction, but any question or comment?
I just ask that you raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about like the spiritualist movement or other universal movements like Mary Baker Eddy and that seem to have some of the same things?
Some things. No, I'm not going to mention it but we could. So if we take this time for question and answers, then we can go over the hour, so that we break up the question and answers in two. So let me expand a little on that. So yes, before the Theosophical Society was founded, there was the spiritualistic movement In the US, they had a more Christian philosophy. They didn't believe in reincarnation. They believed more in heaven and hell, things like that. In France, there was the movement started by Allan Kardec. They called themselves Spiritists. They believed in reincarnation, but in a kind of immediate reincarnation, and many times even with the similar body. You know, in the movies when they show this person looks just like a person in the past, and there is this idea that in all your reincarnations you will look more or less the same. So Blavatsky said, sure, reincarnation exists, but not like that, and you don't reincarnate immediately and things like that. So there were these things. The spiritualistic movement was a good start, and Blavatsky actually studied through them, because there were psychic phenomena happening in the seances, quite remarkable, many of them. And Blavatsky was using that to say, okay, science, you think that you can explain everything without bringing out anything that is beyond the materialistic realm. How do you explain this phenomena? And there were serious scientists that were researching into the seances, you know, these spiritualistic seances where they would invoke the spirit of the dead and things like that. So Blavatsky used that, but she tried to give them a spiritual philosophy behind that, and they rejected it. So as a spiritual path, it was not really helpful, but it was helpful to start bringing people the idea that, yes, there is something after death, and to show scientists that there were things going on that they couldn't explain. You know, scientists at the time were saying, the universe is just like a clock, and it works automatically. All the laws of nature are making the universe works like a machine. So there is no room or need for the spirit, for consciousness, for anything, because this just is a material thing running on its own. So Blavatsky would say, okay, if that is the case, how do we explain this? How do you explain that? You know, at the time there would be materializations of spirits from the side of the medium would come like a kind of cloud, and then the spirit would appear and would speak, and people could interact sometimes with the spirit. And there were scientists testing all of this. Of course, there were a few people who were able to do that, and other people who resorted to tricks to try to get, you know, an audience. But Blavatsky says that these things that were happening in the spiritualistic movement, that after the Theosophical Society was founded, stopped happening, and then it fizzled out. And today there is spiritualism, but they cannot produce any of the phenomena that they were able to. And Blavatsky said, this is because the masters of wisdom were helping to produce this phenomena as part of that agenda of challenging the materialistic science. And then, yes, there was, along with the TS, there was what was called the Christian science at the beginning, then mental science, then developed in the New Thought movement. And they basically, at the beginning, they were focused on health, physical health, and how to try to cure your body through faith. So they were about, you have to believe that Jesus and this and that, and it was a faith movement. Then it became, when the TS began to talk about the power of thought, then they embraced that and began to work like thought had the power to create things. But it was very, narrow in that area. Then after the TS was founded, they started using affirmations. And you see the majority of these movements tend to degenerate, and you end up using affirmations and visualizations to bring a check of $1 million, like in The Secret. So that's the problem. What humanity needs is movements that work with all of this, but with a spiritual intention and not be dragged into materialism. A lot of things that run as spirituality today is another form of materialism. Like Chandong and like Chogyan Trungpa would say spiritual materialism, he would call it. Yes.
So I'm trying to interpret, Blavatsky foresaw Hitler and his rise and felt an urgency to create theosophy to counteract Hitler, war, destruction of humanity by through helping humanity to evolve and to universal brotherhood versus Hitler, war, destruction. Is that correct?
Yes. Probably not to try to avoid it, because in the theosophical view, according to the theosophical view, actions create in the future, and gradually we create our own future and the collective future with our actions, our thoughts, our emotions, not only physical action, our intentions. And the future begins to be formed on the inner planes, let's say, and at some point it precipitates. So depending on the level of, these are like karmic causes that accumulate, and like in physics, if you have something that has a lot of causes producing an effect, it's very difficult to avoid it. But if you have something that has a few causes here, and then you can introduce new causes, suppose of a pool ball that you hit. If you hit another ball and it collides with the original one, you can deviate it. But if you try to do that with a cannonball, you are not going to be able, with a pool, to deviate the cannonball. It's a balance of forces. So what we are creating in the future is similar. We can always change the future with new causes, but when the future begins to settle, you may not be able to prevent it. And the description that Blavatsky gave there seems quite detailed in a sense, so that leads me to believe that that future had been created. So I don't know if she was trying to prevent that, but what you can do is trying to soften it, and by stimulating spirituality in the world, you start creating different causes, right? So yes, that's part of the idea there. All right, so let us continue, and then we can stop again. So let's look at the first point that Blavatsky was mentioning there. One of the ideas that the Theosophical Society brought to the world is this idea of universal brotherhood, without distinctions. Can we create an organization in which people of any creed, or people of both genders, actually Blavatsky and the early women in the Theosophical Society were quite influential in the women's rights around the world. People of any caste or social position and any religion come and cooperate. This was a new idea. Actually, in several countries, the TS got into trouble for this. For example, in India, people of different castes, they couldn't eat together. And in the TS, when there was a meeting and then there was a meal, they were all eating together. The Brahmins, the highest caste, with the servants, the lower caste. So much so that this was in the newspapers. And they had some heat because they were transgressing the rules of society. Same, during the apartheid in South Africa and things like that. But basically, the idea is we need to form a movement that is trying to generate unity with no limitations, a unity with no conditions. And that's still something very necessary today, because we need this. I mean, we see it all over the world that there is still such an emphasis on separation. Even we see it in politics today, all this identity politics. I understand what this comes up, and I think that it may be necessary because we have discriminated for so long different parts of the population that this is a natural reaction. Same with the idea of fighting for women's rights and for whatever part of the population that we have oppressed. There is a need to bring that up to attention and say, we are all equal, we should all have equal opportunities, etc. But eventually, we need to move on to a place where we are all appreciated regardless of the differences. You know, the ideal in the Theosophical Society is unity in diversity. Because unity is not uniformity. The movements that try to produce uniformity are totalitarian movements. When you have some communist experiments, they try to produce unity by imposing uniformity in everybody. And historically, that has not worked. Or in religions, you produce unity by saying everybody has to believe the same thing. We all follow the same person. So you see, every time that humanity is trying to promote unity, it's unity by uniformity. And that is not going to work. We need to have a unity. Well, in the motto of the US, a pluribus unum, something like that. Yeah, doesn't that mean one in the many, or the
Out of many, one.
Out of many, one. Now, those many need to be recognized, and the differences need to be appreciated. It's not that, oh, we are all the same, and we have rights because we are all the same, because then we erase the differences. Differences, instead of separating us, has to enrich us. And that's what the Theosophical Society has been trying to do and is still trying to promote in humanity. And there are more and more movements that recognize this kind of ideal, and they try to embrace it and do it in their own ways. Then another important new development that the society proposed is the idea of giving out publicly teachings that were traditionally taught in closed circles. You know, we always had esoteric movements, the Rosicrucians and the Masons and the Gnostics in the early Christianity and the Hermetists. You know, there were always esoteric movements, or the mystery schools in Greece, Persia, Egypt, Rome. But traditionally, those groups were private, secret, and enclosed. So part of what the Blavatsky's teachers wanted to do, there is a quote in one of the letters. They say, "We think that humanity has attained at least a certain level of intellectual development that people can profit from having access to these teachings." So the TS established a system of public education in esoteric teachings, which is what we are doing right now. But before we go there are many esoteric teachings that were given through the TS publicly for the first time. Not that these teachings didn't exist before, but they were traditionally given in private. So, for example, the idea of spiritual evolution, well, that which is so fundamental in spirituality today, that had not been taught before because the idea of evolution was not there in humanity. Darwin had taught about physical evolution, I think less than 20 years before the TS was founded. And then Blavatsky said, just like there is physical evolution, there is spiritual evolution. She did, when she proposed the teaching, she always tried to say, but hey, I'm not inventing this. You can see this tradition explain it in this way. This tradition explain it in this way. If you read her writing, she's constantly quoting, because she wanted to show that what we are going to see, that there is a common wisdom for all humanity, and all religions are worthy movements, that they shouldn't compete. But in this particular subject, she had a hard time quoting different traditions to prove her point, because these had been given only in very metaphorical ways. But then there are many other, the idea of an aura, that also was new, at least publicly. I mean, you have in Hinduism the idea of subtle bodies, but in all my research, I try to, you can go to the Upanishads and the different sutras, and there is never a description of those bodies as an aura. And that was described by the TS for the first time. The idea of thought forms, the idea of Akashic records. Actually, Olcott invented that phrase, Akashic records. Blavatsky was talking about the memory of nature, and then Olcott called them Akashic records. What else? I have here the idea of, well, the masters of wisdom, astral projection, Lemuria and Atlantis. Although Plato had mentioned Atlantis, it's a very brief mention. The whole mythology of Lemuria and Atlantis was developed by Blavatsky. And many other important teachings that are not so famous, but that are very important. They were all communicated through the Theosophical Society. And then different movements that were founded later, incorporated these teachings and developed them in their own ways and directions. So this is what scholars call the occult renaissance that happened after the TS was founded, and was quite significant spiritually and culturally. And then, as I was mentioning, the TS set up a kind of public spiritual education through this kind of lectures and study groups and books on these things. These things were not common. At the time, you just only had the church. You would go there, hear a sermon. In the Masonic groups, I don't know if at the time they were doing this, but sometimes you could have like a mini lecture there. But again, the Masonic groups were private and closed. So this idea of having study groups and to discuss spiritual things was new in the world. And then another important aspect was to try to bring Eastern philosophy to the West. So at the time, Eastern philosophy was dying, even in the East, because India, Sri Lanka, and all that part of Asia was under colonial power by the British, the French, Portuguese. And they were bringing the modern education, and they were imposing a Christian education to the natives there. And they were bringing the Western education that was modern, and the message was that their religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, was all superstition. Actually, Gandhi, if you read his autobiography, he says that. I mean, he was educated by the British colonial power. He became a lawyer. He thought that Hinduism was all superstition. He went to London in England, and he attended a meeting of the TS, where he met Blavatsky, and they were studying the Bhagavad Gita, which is a Hindu sacred scripture. And he says, it's the first time that I had read the Bhagavad Gita and that I could discover through the discussions in the meetings how much wisdom was there. So that's when he started his career, let's say, to work in what he ended up working. First, he worked in South Africa, and then with the liberation of India. So in the East, all these teachings were dying, and in the West, we didn't know anything about that. This was a time that outside the scholars and some, the transcendentalists here in the US, they had gotten hold of a Bhagavad Gita or, one or two scriptures, and they were studying this. But for the most part, in the West, we didn't know anything about any of these teachings or the idea of enlightenment. Think of the Judeo-Christian tradition. That's all they knew. Heaven, hell, sainthood, I don't know, not much more. All this idea of evolution or different states of consciousness and enlightenment and all that was not known in the West. Of course, mystics, there were always mystics in the West too, but nobody studied the mystics. This was not part of the cultural knowledge of people. So part of what the TS do was to popularize the Eastern teachings, especially Buddhism and Hinduism. Blavatsky would also talk about Taoism or Zoroastrianism, but not so much as Buddhism and Hinduism. And along with that, they went to India to revitalize Hinduism and Buddhism in situ, in their places. Olcott is a national hero in Sri Lanka because he started founding Buddhist schools that would teach the Buddhist teachings and culture and all of this. The Christian missionaries tried to fight him, in every way that they could. He eventually was able to make the laws change because the Buddhists couldn't celebrate any Buddhist celebration. It was all the Christian celebration. So he fought to let them to make a national holiday Wesak, which is a Buddhist, celebration and things like that. And then the same they were doing in India. Annie Besant, the Theosophists were the ones that started the National Indian Congress. The Indian Congress was started after a Theosophical convention by a group of Theosophists, and then all the Freedom for India movement started with them and Annie Besant, and then Gandhi joined, although he had a far more radical view. Besant was already too old, and Gandhi got his way, and it ended up in a lot of violence that he didn't want to. I was in Varanasi, and a scholar, a historian, came to give a lecture to the TS, and she said, if India had followed Besant's plan, India would not have fallen into all the corruption that it had for decades, because Besant's plan was far more gradual and was more sound than just going cold turkey with a population that had no idea what democracy was, and now they had to elect, their representatives and all that. Besant wanted India to be part of the Commonwealth, but have self-rule. Anyway, so the TS was fundamental in bringing the Eastern teachings to the West and reviving them in the East. So Theosophists talked about meditation and yoga and all of that decades before Vivekananda came here, decades before the first Buddhist monks began to come here. So that was also very important, paving the way for all the gurus and monks that would come in the 20th century. Then another important aspect is the holistic approach that Theosophy proposes of life. So the subtitle of Blavatsky's most important work, The Secret Doctrine, is called A Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy. And this is, again, to try to fight the fragmented view of the world that we have, where you only look at the world through religion or through science or through the skeptic philosophy that leads to nihilism and things like that. So from the very beginning, the Theosophical teachings were saying there is no need to separate these things. They can talk to each other. You can have a religion that has a deep philosophy and that is rational. You can have a philosophy that is a way of life that is spiritual, like it was with the Greeks. Today philosophy, now there are more movements that are trying to present philosophy as a way of life. But until the 70s, philosophy was just intellectual. And that still dominates academia, but it is changing slowly. And the same with science. You can have a science that doesn't exclude the spiritual. So as I mentioned, the TS began doing all this interface science and religion and philosophy. Let me break it up again. So we saw universal brotherhood, esoteric teachings, public spiritual education, and Eastern philosophy. Any comments or questions about this? Here, John.
So the popularization of Eastern philosophies, Hinduism and Buddhism, what of Middle Eastern philosophies, Judaism and Islam? Are these compatible together?
Yes, Blavatsky wrote quite a bit about Judaism, especially Kabbalah, and then Annie Besant wrote about Islam, for example. She has a very nice little book called The Beauties of Islam. Now, at the time Islam was becoming more fundamentalist, because originally Islam was quite, I mean, you even have several versions of the Quran that are different from each other, and that people were okay with that. But then, influenced by, I have to go too far back in history, but with the rise of Christianity during late antiquity, came the idea of one God, one truth, one government. So when Christianity allied itself with the Roman Empire, this idea of one law, one rule, one belief began to be spread in Western tradition, in the Western culture. Now, probably at the time that was necessary, so I'm not saying this in any blameful way, but it also led from the high culture that was in Greece and Rome, it led into the Dark Ages, Now, in the meantime, in the East, all the science and philosophy was being preserved in Iraq, Iran, all in the Middle East. Actually, when the Renaissance came to Europe, it was because all the writings of the Greeks that had been lost in the West, they had been preserved in the East, in the Middle East, and then brought back into Europe, written in Arabic and things like that. So for a long time, Islam was a very open religion. But toward the 19th century, it began to be influenced by that Christian view of one power, one law, one book. See that the religions of the book is only within the Judeo-Christian traditions. Other religions have many books. We talk about the Vedas as being big books in Hinduism, but that's more a Western kind of Protestant view. Okay, you have to have some main books, because in Hinduism, the sutras and the Gitas and all that, Upanishads, are as or more important than the Vedas. Anyway, so when the TS was founded, Islam had already gotten into what we see today, in the Middle East. But Besant tried to point out to the beauties of Islam, because it's a beautiful religion. If you can, divorce it from the political manipulation that is going on right now, it's a beautiful religion. So, yes, there was mention of all of that. But Blavatsky said that in the spirituality of the world, according to her, came from India originally. It spread in the Mesopotamia, the Assyrians, Chaldeans, then to Egypt, and then to Greece and Rome, and then Christianity came up there, and then that generated the Western tradition. So what she said is that let's go to the origin of the source of the wisdom that we have today, and try to get to the source as much as possible. Not that she claimed Hinduism per se is the source, but that, many of the spiritual truths that we inherited through the Mesopotamia and Egypt and Greece came originally from there. So I think she made more emphasis on Hinduism and Buddhism for that reason. Ed?
Do you have any theories on why we were so successful?
Why
the TS was so successful in
changing
accomplishing all
I'm
this?
going to talk about that, yes, in a little bit. Yeah. Shall we continue? We'll continue a few more points. There is not much more left. So there is this idea of the irrational spirituality that encourage people to use intelligence and discourage blind faith. Not faith. One thing is faith, a different thing is blind faith. You need faith to be spiritual in the world. But it's a faith that comes from your understanding. You understand, if we act in this way, this is not going to lead to anything good. So I know perfectly clear that this is the path that I have to take. Maybe other people have different paths. But I understand this. But then you need the faith to persevere in spite of the difficulties and all that. Faith is very important. But you have blind faith, that is superstition. You have what you may call a rational faith. And then you have a direct perception of the spiritual truths. Direct perception is when you perceive in higher states of consciousness these things as realities. But between that and not knowing, you have what we call a rational faith, that is the idea of examining these other worldviews, and if they make sense to you, embrace them. Now, they may make sense to you and you still may be wrong, but if you embrace them intelligently, you will continue to grow and you will discover eventually the mistakes that your previous worldview had. So it's not a problem to be partially right and partially wrong, because we all are. The problem is when you embrace something as ultimate truth and without even understanding it, just because if we would take Blavatsky said this and we just repeat it, then that's a problem. That's superstition. We don't do that in the TS. I mean, I'm using quotes from Blavatsky and all of that, but this is open. There are people who don't believe in Blavatsky and don't like what she writes, and that's perfectly fine, right? So the idea of a rational spirituality, we can be, and this is what started the difference between religion and spirituality. That is today, people say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. This is the idea. This is what the TS studied, an alternative approach to religion. That is what we call today spirituality. Then another important aspect is the comparative studies. Our second object in the Theosophical Society is to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. Now, scholars began to do comparative studies of religions at the same time that the TS was founded. Now, those studies were being conducted by scholars that were Christian, and their agenda, because the colonies had gone into the East and they find, all these different religions. So in general, their agenda was to compare them and show how Christianity was better than Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, whatever it is. So the early scholars wrote from the point of view of justifying the supremacy of the Christian view. Then later scholars began to try to be a little more fair, but they kept focusing on differences. And even today, we were invited a couple of years ago to go to Harvard, because the Center for Religious Studies in Harvard was founded with the money that a Theosophist donated to Harvard to start this Center for Comparative Religion. So they had a congress, and they invited some of us in the TS along with other scholars that work in the field of religion or study of theosophy and its influence. And scholars continue to do comparative studies, but in general, they focus on all the differences, how this is different from that. And in my presentation, I was saying, in the TS, we don't do that. It's not that we ignore the differences, but what we are trying to do is to highlight the similarities, because we are trying to promote this sense of cooperation, of tolerance, of kinship, of brotherhood or sisterhood. So it is necessary not only to, of course, when we study two religions, you say, in these ways, these are different, these views are different from this, but then you say, okay, how can that help you? How can, let's say, reincarnation. Modern Christianity doesn't believe in reincarnation. Now, that was not the case in early Christianity. But, you say, okay, what is a good effect of the idea that there is no reincarnation? If you think that there are many lifetimes for you to improve and all that, you can be a little more lazy. Well, if I don't do it now, I'll do it in my next lifetime, Some Zen Buddhists, they would say, when you sit to meditate, think that this is your last meditation. After this, you die. What is the effect of that? You put all your attention there. This is the moment where this has to happen. So, you say, okay, you have to be the best possible human that you can be, and this is the only life that you have to do it. It concentrates your energy. Now, of course, thinking that there is only one life produces a lot of problems in many other ways. So you can study the different religions and try to see, you study them with a sense of openness, and you try to be kind with the traditions, not critical. You don't go to study a tradition to show how wrong they are. You go there to say, what can I learn? How can I interpret this in the best possible way? And that's what the TS has been trying to promote. And as I was saying in my presentation there, I think that if scholarship could engage in this in this way with the comparative studies, they could serve as a force to promote friendliness between different religions. A lot of the conflicts today are based on religions. So why would you keep working on focusing on the differences? We need something different. We need to look at the similarities, the sameness. That's part of what the TS has been trying to do. And then also the idea of that there exists an ancient wisdom. So Blavatsky said, all religions come from a same universal truth. Not that all of them are the same, obviously they are not, but there are universal truths which are the same for all humanity. For example, the example that I give is if there are people who know math, or think Indians develop their own math, in the West the Greeks develop their own math, and different cultures, they all came up to the same mathematical truths. Because there isn't a Hindu math, a Christian math. The world is, or reality is in a certain way, and if you can perceive that aspect of reality, you will see the same, because it's the same reality. So in the same way that those who developed their mathematical power, because in ancient times most people didn't know math, they arrived at perceiving the same truths. So Blavatsky says it's the same with spirituality. Any person in any culture, in any time, that develops the ability to perceive the truth in a direct way will perceive the same. Now, truth is formless and is infinite. So when you come to a particular, to give that message to a particular group of people, you will choose some aspects of truth. The problems that the Buddha had to correct among the Hindus there were different than the problems that Jesus had to correct among the Jewish people there. So the teachers will focus on what is needed at the time, and that's the reason why there is a difference of emphasis. And then, of course, as you go down the history, these teachers in general didn't write down. So in the oral tradition, things may be lost, or the followers may not have understood properly these difficult truths. And so there are many differences in religions, but the idea is that they all have a common origin, and that when we study religions, we should try to have a glimpse of that ancient wisdom that is common to all. And we are coming to the end. The last point I wanted to mention is the cultural influence of the Theosophical Society. It influenced the fields of esotericism, religion, literature, art, education, politics, science, and more. I don't want to go through a list of names. I prepared a list of names, but all I want to do is to show you the list briefly. This is a list of a few names that may be more recognizable, just to give you a sense of the influence of Theosophical teachings. These are all people who said that they had studied Theosophy or they had been members of the TS. So in the field of esotericism, we have a lot of organizations that were founded after the TS. These were all people who were Theosophists or influenced by Theosophy. I'll leave you the list there. Since this is on YouTube, you can see in the video later if you want to read that. Oh, and Ken Wilber. Then religion, there were a lot of the main people in Buddhism, to spread Buddhism in the West. They were all either members of the TS, or like Suzuki, his wife was a member of the TS, and he mentions Theosophy. These other people were all members of the TS. Then the translation of Hindu scriptures. Vivekananda was not a member, but actually it was Annie Besant who brought Vivekananda to the West for the first time for the World Congress in Chicago. And then these are important Hindus, Vivedi and Bhagavan Das, that were members of the society. Then art, you have all the abstract art. They were all Theosophists, and they were trying to represent theosophical truths in an abstract way. Then you have musicians. So sorry, I went too fast, but let me go back. You have musicians, and Rukmini Devi was fundamentally in the renaissance of Indian dancing. In India, the Indian dancing was left only to prostitutes, so it was seen as something very low. And she said, no, every movement in Indian dances is symbolic, it has a spiritual teaching, and she was the wife of one of the international presidents of the TS. Then in literature, we have some very famous people, all the Irish kind of Renaissance at the time. Most of them were TS members or very influenced by Theosophy. Then, interesting enough, people who worked on horror stories, weird stories, horror stories, they were writing letters to each other saying, have you read The Secret Doctrine? It's full of wonderful things. Some of them didn't believe any of that, but it was an infinite source of inspiration for weird stories. Then in education, Krishnamurti, Montessori, Steiner, they were all involved with the TS. Philosophy and psychology also, these are people who studied different fields. In politics, as I mentioned, especially in India, all the famous people in politics in India were influenced, and there are more, were influenced by the TS. And in other countries too, like in Argentina, we have early members of the TS there that our streets have their names. They were important politicians. Many politicians in the early 20th century, they were idealistic and quite philosophic. You can't think of politicians in that way any longer. But many politicians around the world were influenced by Theosophy at the time. And in science, that's where there is not so much influence because science has become more materialistic, although Edison was a member, William Crookes, who is the one that discovered the electron and what we call plasma today, was a member. Einstein, the niece, said that he had The Secret Doctrine next to his bed. In more modern times, Sheldrake lived in a jar in the TS there. So that's just to show you, how Theosophy influenced a lot of fields. But there is a lot to be done. You can see that Theosophical ideas, which were at that time not accepted at all, have permeated our culture 150 years later. I was talking with Ed, the idea of animal rights, for example. The early Theosophists began a movement against vivisection, opening the animals when they are alive to study them. At a time where most Western people thought animals have no soul, no, they are machines. This is what Descartes, the French philosopher, said. If you hit an animal, he said, and you hear the cry of the animal, that's not a signal of pain. That's just like the wiring of the sound of a machine when it malfunctions. So this is what people thought of animals. And the Theosophical tradition began to explain why animals are alive and conscious and have a soul, etc. And today, the animals' rights movement and how we see animals is vastly different. Then you have the same, something more superficial, but vegetarianism. people were saying that you couldn't live if you were vegetarian. I mean, even in Argentina, when I was growing up, the doctors would come after your mom if you said that you were vegetarian. And today it's fashionable for many people. And many other ideas that gradually, today you hear karma, reincarnation everywhere, in the publicities, newspapers. So ideas are permeating. But now is the work that is a deeper kind of work that is trying to encourage an inner transformation, a spiritual transformation from selfishness to altruism, from competition to cooperation. That's not simply about spreading ideas, it's about spreading the thirst for transformation. And that's the work that is ahead. We are going to explore that during the weekend. So any comments or questions before we close about this last part or anything in the talk? Yeah, raise your hand if you have anything.
I still have the same question. Why were we so successful?
Oh, why? Yes. So we are going to explore it during the weekend, but at the time when these ideas were ridiculed, and it's always hard to be different from the rest and not to be appreciated. And the early Theosophists had a really hard time. You really had to be adventurous to become a member of the TS. This happens today in science with many scientists. Any scientist that publicly shows some appreciation of the spiritual is immediately excluded. This happened to Rupert Sheldrake and to Amit Goswami, that we had him here, and to many other scientists. So there is a price to be paid, and at that time, early 20th century, there was certainly a price to be paid by being a member of the TS. Today, that's not a problem, fortunately. But anyway, Annie Besant was saying at the time, you have to trust how these things work, because as we come together, discuss all of these things, try to apply them in our daily life, you start producing a kind of spiritual force and what she called thought forms that begin to permeate the mental atmosphere of humanity. In the same way that we have a physical atmosphere, we have an emotional atmosphere that we call the astral plane or emotional plane. We have a mental atmosphere, the mental plane, where ideas are energies there. So she said, as these ideas begin to be reproduced on the mental plane, they will become more and more available to regular people, and then they won't see them as being as weird as they sound today. They will start feeling that there is something there. So she said, in 100 years, all these ideas will be accepted by our culture. And that happened. And according to her, it was because what we are trying to do is to change the mental atmosphere of humanity. And then people are free. This is not trying to manipulate how people think. Then people are free. Today there are very selfish people, even if all those ideas are available, and they are free to be selfish. But those who are open, then all these ideas is like they are in the background, and when you come to these teachings, you recognize something there. So according to her, she said the lectures and all of that is the least important part of the work. The more important part of the work is the changing of the mind of humanity in that way. And for the future, it's the same work. So we are going to look during the weekend what changes we think humanity needs, and the way to change humanity is by changing yourself. It's always that's the way. Over there. Let me say something more while you get ready. talking about this move from selfishness to altruism, competition to cooperation. She said that in 600 years, this will be the rule in humanity. You know, when we are talking about this is, I know in the New Age we like to think that in the next fancy number, humanity will be transformed automatically. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And it doesn't happen that quick. But Annie Besant and Leadbeater, who were clairvoyants, similar to what Blavatsky wrote about the Second War, they say in about 700 years from the time that they wrote, we see that humanity has embraced all these ideals of cooperation. They will regard the way we live today as barbaric. But for that to happen, this is something that, you know, it's not going to just happen. A group of human beings have to engage in trying to live in this way. So she said, the culture will move, if we do our work, the culture will move in the wake of the Theosophical Society and gradually will go in that direction. She was talking about the TS because it was the only organization at the time doing that. I would include any organization that is seriously working on this is participating in that work. But she said, humanity will move in the wake of the work of spiritual people. And she was right with the ideas. I hope she's right with this too. Yes.
Yes, can you speak on the adoption of Theosophical terminology of, let's say, for example, the Nazis, because they use that term Aryan Brotherhood, and other supremacists. Also speak on that on the so-called Nazi hit list, Theosophists were also on there, I believe, like 3rd or 4th place.
Theosophists were?
They were considered like as Jews.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
3rd or 4th place on there.
Yes. So when Hitler came to power, he wrote to the international president of the TS, that was George Arundel at the time, and he said, if you change the first object of the Theosophical Society, that, you know, is this universal brotherhood without any distinctions, I think he proposed some modification or something like that. He said, I'm not going to, I'll leave you alone. Because not so much Hitler, I read what scholars have researched into this, not so much Hitler was interested in occult teachings, but it seems that Himmler, his right hand, was interested in occultism in general. He was more interested in the paganism of the Northern Europe and the Germanic and Nordic mythology, but they were interested in occultism in general. So Hitler wrote that letter to Arundel, and Arundel wrote a letter to all the members in Germany, get out of there, because something is coming. So yes, they persecuted Theosophists, and I suppose anybody that would stand against their agenda. And the Nazis used and actually misused a lot of sacred symbols and words. For example, the word Aryan, it comes from Aryan in Sanskrit, and Aryan is the term that the Hindus used for themselves, the early Hindus. Arya means noble, the noble ones. So they refer to their ancestors. As we say, the founding fathers, they would refer to their ancestors as the Aryans, the noble ones. And it's a very normal word in Sanskrit. And in Pali, you see in the Eightfold Noble Path, the word for noble is Arya. And then the scholars used to call the Indians, the Indo-European people, Aryan people. This was the scholars in the 19th century. Because all our languages, English, French, Spanish, and some European languages, they all come from Sanskrit originally. So all this branch of humanity was called the Aryan people or Aryan people, the Indo-European people. And Hitler used the word Aryan for he misused a lot of symbols. I think the SS are runes, also runes, Nordic runes. So it seems that Himmler researched into different esoteric groups, but they took whatever they wanted and interpreted it in ways that there is no justification for that interpretation. So today's scholars don't regard that the Nazis really were influenced, by theosophy or esotericism. They were following more what was called the Ariosophy, which was kind of esotericism based on Europe. But yes, I mean, Himmler was interested in all of that, and they were trying to pick things that could justify their agenda, right? But the spirit is completely the opposite to the esoteric symbols and teachings. Anything else?
You had mentioned, was it religious fundamentalism and materialism at that time, and to offer something new that's kind of a balance or something in the middle. And then all of that led to that note you shared about Blavatsky talking about a war. When we look at 2025, I feel like there still is a lot of religious fundamentalism, and I wasn't there in the 1800s, but it feels like there's even more materialism in some ways. Yeah. And we have leaders in this world, in this country, who seem very similar to the energies that were working at that time. What do you think about like our current state? I guess not necessarily personally, but as the Theosophical Society, where we find ourselves in a very similar place that they did at the beginning of this.
Yeah. No, again, this is the same as with the war. I don't think that they thought that this could be, eliminated, because this is what they saw that was coming in the cycle. There will be this polarization. What they wanted to do is to offer like this an alternative option, so that it is not the whole of humanity that will be divided into those two, so that people like us have an alternative. And I would say, I always mention a few years ago, we had a summer convention here in Wheaton, where there was a representative of Hindus, of Muslim, Jewish, and their presentations were all very theosophical in the spirit. They respected each other, they appreciated the teachings of the others, they were quoting each other. It was wonderful to see. And that is, I think, a sample of the effect of the work of the TS and all those who joined that kind of movement from outside the TS, right? But the TS was the first organization to start that. That's why I'm referring to that. But you see that spirit is impregnating some of the representatives of the religions. So that third way, in between those two, still exists, not only in the TS, but also with this kind of religious people who are open-minded, who want to cooperate. So I think that's what the masters wanted to create, a movement in the world that approaches religion in this way, so that people like us can follow that path, whether you do it through the TS or through these more, I don't know how to call them, more open religious representatives in whatever religion it is. Yes, back there, and this if we have to.
You get the prize for the very last
All
question.
right, so it better be the wisest question. No pressure.
Okay. I just wanted to know from your personal experience traveling over the years, what, in the beginning with the TS, it was about they wanted to inspire spirituality throughout the world, to have more peace versus aggressive communities. And so were there any countries or communities from your personal experience that you observe, wow, there's a really peaceful feeling in this country, or a peaceful feeling in this community, or the opposite, noticing a transition of, wow, it seems to be a lot more aggressive than it was when I was here 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yes, I think people, in the TS we travel, especially if we work on the education aspect, we travel to different countries. And you can see, for example, to talk outside of the TS, I lived in India for 2 years in the the international headquarters in India. And then I would visit some temples, and I without knowing much about who they were, I could feel, okay, there is spirituality here. Now this is just a commercial thing, because you have a lot of the temples have become commercials, but not because there were people selling or not. And it may have been my imagination, but in my personal experience, I could feel the difference, where there was serious spirituality and where it was superficial and it was a touristic thing. And then, I live in a Theosophical centers, like here, this is a Theosophical center. I live in one in California, and people who visit that center is called Crotona Institute of Theosophy. Crotona, Pythagoras created a spiritual community that he called Crotona. So this is why the founder of Crotona was trying to resemble something like that. And people who come to Crotona, they say that there is a special atmosphere there. I live there, so I don't notice it in particular. I love living there, but people do say that. And so I think it is palpable. Now, I think that all the unrest today, or at least a large part of the unrest today, is the result of the evolution of human consciousness. Because if you look at what is happening today, and you compare to, take any issue, the issue of discrimination or the human rights in any field, look at how that issue was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and you will see that things were even worse than they are today, but nobody reacted to that because our consciousness was more dormant to that aspect. So there was no conflict because nobody noticed. And today there is so much strife, not necessarily because things are getting worse, but because there is a sizable group in humanity that is saying, no, I don't accept this. And that's where the conflict comes up. Because it's not, I think that studying history is very important. I listen to podcasts, from scholars. It's not that thing. I did a program where I went to, there are some non-governmental organizations that have statistics from the last 300 years or 200 years, depending, on all the issues in the world: poverty, education, human rights, equality, all of that. All the numbers are all improving. They have been constantly improving. There is so much more equality and education and health than 100 years ago. And yet we have this sense that we are in the world, worst world that there has been. And I think that's an illusion out of the people, consciousness in people changed and said, we are not accepting this any longer. So I'm not saying that there are no problems. There are problems and we need to solve them. But the unrest is a sign of the success of the spiritual growth in humanity. At least that's what I think.